I am modeling an entire Aston Martin Valhalla in Blender, and this is part 3 of my series. In the last part, we modeled all the middle part of the car, and today we're going to model all of the parts that surround the engine. You can follow this tutorial series even if you are a beginner, and as always, I want to remind you that all the images I use as references are available for free on my Patreon. So make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you don't want to miss the next videos. This said, let's get back to work. Before getting to the back part of the car, I want to fix an issue I didn't notice on the last video. Here's a little problem with the door of our car, and if we try to add a loop cut, it's not going to be placed correctly. Actually, the problem is here on this group of faces that are not filled correctly. Just select these two vertices and click J to join them. Then we can add the loop cut like normal. Obviously, after that, we'll have to recreate the door again on the other side. Now we can model the back of the car. To start, I'm going to use the border of the door as a starter, so select it, duplicate with Shift+D, then separate to new object with P. I'm also going to tidy up my workspace by renaming this object to back, then putting the rest in the Finish tab. Now I carefully started to draw the outline of our back of the car. I extended some of the lines, then filled the upper part. After filling the faces, I started to outline this part where there's going to be this closure on the wheel. In the first part, one of you suggested me to use a bevel modifier instead of making them one by one. I think it's a great idea, so let's do that. Also, really thanks for the help. To use the modifier, you'll have to dissolve any edge loops we made, then add the modifier, putting it at the top of the hierarchy, then setting the number of segments to 2 and the limit method to weight. After doing that, just select the edges you want to bevel and set the bevel weight to 0.001. After adjusting some small details, I started to make the carbon fiber body around the car. To make this part, I had to subdivide the edges along the shape, and then I joined all the vertices together. I also had to put some edge loops here to make the corners more sharp. To extend this part, I just moved some vertices on the x-axis. I had to adjust this line too. After doing that, I started to bend the final part of the carbon body as we did on the other part. To do that, I just extruded this vertices inward and scaled this vertex inward too, positioning my cursor between two vertices. Now I'm going to create this little triangle that goes around the rim of the car. To do that, I selected the faces we made earlier and I extruded them down. But then I noticed some little errors with my model. There was this group of faces that had to go up. Then I had to create a little more space out here. After fixing these issues, I continued by adding some loop cuts to our triangle. Then I moved some vertices to create even more space. After doing that, I started to carefully outline the rim of the car, and I added another loop cut to get square faces. Also, I aligned the vertices at the back of this shape together. After finishing this part, I started to make the rim of the wheel. To do this, I firstly had to delete some vertices to avoid shading issues. This is done to avoid extruding a 2D face from the corner of a closed shape. I extruded these faces as they don't damage our model. Then I extended some faces and aligned them in a straight line that covers the wheel. Finally, I outlined the inner part of the rim and added a loop cut to make the outer edge more sharp. After that, I started modeling everything until the end of the rim. This was surely the most complicated part of the model for me, as the blueprint here was almost useless. However, after making many parts over and over again, I think I achieved a decent result. Basically, what I did is that I extruded a few lines to drive the main curves, and then I tried filling them by using grid fill and by joining them manually. As soon as I finished the curve that goes around the wheel, I started making the part that covers the engine. You can see from the video that I had to remake this part a few times, so don't be afraid to delete what you're doing and start again from scratch. After that, I had to merge them, and to do that, I gradually filled different sections by making some lines to drive the geometry. I don't know why, but on this part I couldn't use grid fill, so I created faces manually. After I filled everything, I passed on fixing little details like making a little more sharp transition from the part that covers the engine to the rest of the car. After closing everything, I used a matte cap to detect imperfections. And now we can concentrate on the rest of the metal body. Firstly, I tried to model this part right here, but I figured out something that might seem stupid, but it's not immediate to understand. This part right here of the blueprints is actually the middle part of the spoiler, so don't make the mistake I was almost making. After that, I also figured out how to make the spoiler. Basically, I had to delete these faces, then I had to shape the remaining vertices so that I could extrude them easily on the y-axis. To do this, I obviously had to meticulously use my blueprint and my reference images to orient the shape of my model. After adjusting everything, I defined the initial part of the spoiler and tried to extrude it out. However, here I had a little trouble making this edge look right. I found that by making a face here, the model looks normal. However, I'd be curious to know if there's better ways to do that, so please leave a comment to let me know. Also, I found out that by merging this 3 vertices together, we get a better result. Then I went on making the part that is under the spoiler and ends the metal part of the car. Firstly, I wanted to fill this by merging the part on the bottom with the upper part, but I couldn't do this because of way too much pinching around my model. So I ended up making this part separated from the upper part of the metal body. After filling this part, I passed the following hour on making things like fixing bad topology or making loop cuts to sharpen some edges. To revision my topology, I usually use shade flat, as it shows me the final topology the model should have after applying subdivisions. Now that we have completed all the part concerning the metal part of the spoiler, we can fill the rest like normal. Just note that you need to create a sort of curve that goes up then down to guarantee aerodynamics to the car. I filled every part of the car except one where I'm going to create this sort of black air intake. To create the part I mentioned earlier, I insetted the face I leaved. Then I extruded them in to create a hole. It created this strange thing right here. I tried to remake the hole, but it didn't solve the problem, so I had to rearrange the topology a little bit. Basically, I had to make a loop cut to sharpen this edge here, but I couldn't because then I would have broken existing geometry. So I made another loop cut, and I joined faces to form quads. Our Aston Martin is actually starting to look very good. Let's make the engine cover. To do that, I first had to make these quads here, so I started to model them. I treated all the remaining squares as a whole so the eye could make a preciser shape, and then I could separate every square by using V. I also had to make multiple edge loops to maintain the form we need. I separated all of the squares, and for curving them, I placed my 3D cursor on the center of the grid, and I scaled all of the edges on the y-axis. It's time to do the engine cover of our car. I simply created some lines, made sure that there are the same number of edges on each side, and filled. By this time, you should know the drill. After making this first part, I firstly had to lower a part of the windshield so I can make the hole where air comes in. Then I got the border, separated it to new object, and joined it with our back part. After doing this, it could start making the big air intake that is on the car. To do it, I simply made some lines filled and extruded everything up. Make sure to create this little bend right here to add detail. I had to switch the perspective of my blueprint again to better see what I'm doing. I noticed this problem with our model. This happened because Blender has stretched out our mesh, which has been solidified by our solidify modifier. Don't worry, I'm going to fix it later. Outline this rectangle so we can model it later. Now let's make this little rectangle that sits on the back of our car. I tried to do it one time, but it was way too big, so I remade it, insetting two faces instead of one. Before closing the part underneath our air intake, I want to do this part here. To do that, I duplicated this set of vertices and filled the rest of the shape. After that, I made this little bump by just moving some faces up. After dealing with the main details, I had to create a thicker border. So I separated everything by selecting it with L and pressing P. Then I modified the thickness value in the Modifiers tab. Also, I had to orient the rotation of my border by putting some vertices underneath the border of my model. Finally, I used creases to sharpen the borders and passed on, making this sort of exhaust. Also, I changed my matte cap to see better what's going on. To make the exhaust, I simply added a circle to my model and used proportional editing to shape it like in the blueprint. Then I filled it, rotated it a little bit, and extruded it out. Then I extruded the tip inwards to add more detail. Now let's fill the part underneath our main air intake. I simply extruded a line down and started to use grid fill to create everything. Here I didn't connect anything to the other parts to avoid shading issues. Also, I fixed the problem we encountered earlier. The only thing remaining for this part is the spoiler, so let's make it. I firstly selected all of the vertices that are on the border of our spoiler, and I duplicated them. After that, I extruded everything and created the rough shape of our spoiler. This spoiler is a little bent, so I used V to separate these two parts, then I moved them down. This part has a curve that goes up, then down. The other one only goes down. After making this, I made the supports on which our spoiler stands. To do that, I beveled an edge with only 2 segments, and then I extruded the face down. Also, I had to extrude all this faces up to fill this hole. And I added creases to fix these angles. After that, I made an edge loop sharpening the edges on the bottom of the spoiler, and I made a little rectangle to contain the curves. To do this, I simply duplicated a vertex and made the rectangle separated from the rest. Finally, the back of the car is complete. The only thing we have to do now is mirror it on the other side. I added a mirror modifier on top of the modifiers tab and did the same thing with the other part that we did. Also, I wanted to adjust this part a little bit. And look how beautiful our car is starting to look. The next part is going to be the last one for this part of the series, and we are going to do all the rear part of the car, the wheels, the rear view mirrors, and all the little details like the Aston Martin logo on the front and the back of the car. This said, maybe let me know in the comments if I should color our car in Blender, Unreal Engine, or both. And as always, see you in the next video.